Hello again, and welcome to the second in the series of 48 lectures on the foundations of Western civilization. This lecture is entitled, History Begins at Sumer. The lecture borrows its title from a quite well-known book by a scholar named Samuel Noah Kramer, who taught for many years at Johns Hopkins University. This was a little book in which he recorded a whole series of firsts in human recorded history, all of which he associated with the people of Sumer. What is Sumer? Sumer is a small region in the south of what is today Iraq. And so that is where our story is going to start. And then slowly but surely, as we move through this lecture, we're going to go through the Mesopotamian world, that is to say, the land between the rivers Tigris and Euphrates. Now, civilization takes its rise in Mesopotamia shortly before 3000 BC, perhaps as early as 3500 BC. And we'll begin at about that point in Sumer, and we'll talk about some small city-states in that region. And then we'll notice that Sumer is conquered again and again by persons from the outside, by people generally from the north or perhaps from the east. And one of the interesting things that we'll observe in that process is that as Sumer is conquered, Sumerian culture conquers the conquerors and spreads with them and begins to form a somewhat more uniform civilization really throughout this larger Mesopotamian region, and then westwards towards the Mediterranean Sea and eastwards towards the frontier of what we would think of today as Iran. So Mesopotamia is all the land between the two rivers, Tigris and Euphrates, and we'll come to this, but we're going to start with Sumer, a little region in the south of what is now Iraq. Now, I mentioned in the first lecture on Western civilization and foundations that we could debate all day, whether civilization began in Mesopotamia or began in Egypt. We'll turn to Egypt in our next lecture, and we'll see that civilization arises in these places more or less simultaneously. It's also the case, as a result of recent archaeological work, that some think that a place called Tel Hamukar in what is now northeastern Syria may actually go back just as far as Sumer itself. But at least at the present time, we know a lot less about Tel Hamukar. So we're going to focus on Sumer today and Mesopotamia a little more generally, and then Egypt in the next lecture. Now, the Uruk period. Now, in Sumer, there were a number of cities. Uruk, Eridu, Lagash. There was a whole series of them. A number of these cities have been excavated by archaeologists. And Uruk gives its name to the early period, from about 3800 to about 3200 BC. This was in many ways a remarkably creative place and time. Now, again, the development of the Uruk period was a bit leisurely, just as we saw that the Neolithic Revolution was a bit leisurely. It took about 5,000 years to work itself out. At Uruk, we see, for example, the invention of the wheel and the plow. Two very important ways of controlling nature, controlling the environment, developing agriculture, as we discussed in the last lecture. We see the first orchards planted, dates, figs, and olives. For the first time, people are actually planting orchards, trying to control crops for themselves, as opposed to simply picking and plucking whatever happened to be available. We find the development of metal casting, making weapons in the first place, but then also making jewelry and other objects. This is also a time when writing first emerges in Mesopotamia, writing of a very particular kind, cuneiform. Now that comes from the Latin cuneus, which means wedge. So cuneiform writing is wedge-shaped writing. A scribe would take a wedge-tipped stylus, doesn't have a point, has sort of a wedge on the end, and make various marks in wet clay. The clay would then be left in the sun to dry, or the clay might be put in an oven and baked. And eventually it formed a very permanent record. Gradually, and we'll talk about this a little bit later in the lecture, literature begins to be produced, but early on what we have basically are government records, bureaucratic records, and a certain number of legal documents and a certain number of religious documents. But in any case, this formed a durable and memorable tribute to those people. Now, it's also interesting to say that this was not a particularly efficient information technology, as we might say today. You can only imagine carrying any reasonably large book around with each page, as it were, incised on stone tablets. This didn't make it very easy to keep information, to disseminate information, but it did, for the first time, make it possible to preserve information. in a fairly durable way. And there are thousands upon thousands upon thousands of these clay tablets still surviving today for scholars to look at and to work with. Well, I emphasized in the first lecture on the rise of civilization that we've got to have cities. And indeed, this is the period when cities arise. And when they begin to take on some of the characteristics of cities from then, really until much later times. All right, so as I emphasized a moment ago, there's a number of them. They are small, independent city-states. There is no nation-state of Sumer. There is Ur and Uruk and Lagash, and these are basically small, independent towns. They began to have circuits of walls, sometimes up to about 5 miles in circumference. That's a fairly large settlement for such an early time. And buildings made almost entirely of mud brick, or mud brick over wooden framing. Now, it's very important to say that the Mesopotamians were not sort of dull-witted. It wasn't that they couldn't build in other materials. They didn't have stone. Stone was very far away. So, for example, we don't find in Mesopotamia the kind of monumental architecture that we find in Egypt, or that we find later on in Greece, or in other places. They simply didn't have stone available, and you can only build so large using wood and mud brick. Now, the creation of the walls around the towns, there's a good deal of evidence that these walls were built in the first place as sort of symbolic representations of the towns, and gradually over time rebuilt and rebuilt and rebuilt to serve as defensive tools. Why? Well, we'll come to that in a few minutes. Quite simply, rivalry among these cities. In these cities, the earliest impressive buildings are always temples. The temples usually took the form of a ziggurat. Now, a ziggurat is a sort of a high banked structure built up in a series of steps from sort of ground level up a certain distance. This is probably the sort of thing, for example, that in the Old Testament we read about as the Tower of Babylon, as the Tower of Babel, you see, that was being built, this thing that was going to reach all the way up to heaven. Now, if the largest buildings in these cities are ziggurats, are temples, what does this tell us about the people then, and about that society? Well, religion was important, and the priestly class was very important. That seems pretty clear. But there are those walls, after all, and they are going to become a factor a bit later. When we move into what we call the dynastic period of Mesopotamian history, the period from about 2800 to perhaps 2350 or thereabouts, we see a time of fierce competition among these little cities, and perhaps inside them too. In other words, the struggles on the outside, the struggles between cities, may very well have begun to lead to social struggles inside the cities. And we begin to see, for example, the building of palace complexes, and we begin to see the rise of sort of local big shots. The text at the time called them lugals, which basically means big shot, kings, important individuals, powerful individuals on the local scene. And as I mentioned a moment ago, city walls began to be larger, stronger, and more important. Now, with these kings, we meet for the first time in the Western tradition a particular kind of institution, monarchy, which will be with us right through these lectures all the way to the end. And we meet a particular kind of monarchy. These kings were thought to have been put in place by the gods to rule with the special favor of the gods, to be accorded victory, for example, in battle by the gods, to be accorded prosperity by the gods. They were not, and this is very important, they were not themselves thought to be gods, but they were thought to have been put in place by and to be made specially answerable to the gods. We call that theocratic kingship. Two nice Greek words, theos and kratos, rule by God, but rule by God through a particular agent on earth, a king. So one of the earliest justifications for kings, then, is that they are people chosen out by the gods. Now, why would that have been the case? Was that people's idea in the very first place? Probably not. Probably what we see here is that as individuals came to exercise leadership over a society, they had to find some way of describing, of justifying, you see, who they were, the position they had, the power that they had. And so they did this through particular connections with their gods. Now, as warfare became more important, excuse me, as warfare became more important, particularly between these various cities, we notice something else, large landowners. Now, It's very hard for us today to say exactly why this happened, how it happened, what the mechanism was that produced some people who owned a great deal more land than others, and then some people who worked on the land of these more powerful people. The fact that these large landowners began to form a kind of a warrior aristocracy, that's not so difficult to understand, because these were obviously the most prominent people in a local town who had to assume some responsibility either for defending that town against the attacks of others, or perhaps for leading an attack by your town on the next town over. So these people as warrior aristocrats, and warrior aristocrats are going to be with us right through this entire course of lectures, their presence is not surprising. Their presence isn't odd. That's easy to explain. What in the first place led to the social differentiation so that some people had more land than others and thus a greater stake in the society than others? That's trickier. It's also important to bear in mind that with any of these towns, even with a circuit of walls, let's say of 5 miles or thereabouts, the agricultural land was not in the town. There might have been some house gardens in the town. The land was outside. If the city is going to be subject to attack by outsiders, then those persons who own that land are going to have a very real interest in what's going on outside those walls as well as inside the walls, you see? And so what we see is a society where kings are increasingly advised by other warrior aristocrats. Clearly, in the social dynamics and the social mechanisms of the towns, these kings had to get along with these warrior aristocrats. That's clear. And it's clear that they had to listen to them. It's clear that they had to take their advice. And probably the tension at the other end of that is precisely these kings trying to say, no, no, we're here because of the gods. We answer only to the gods. We answer only to the gods in the sense of we don't answer to these guys. Because, of course, what they had to do was answer to those guys. So we can see a sense of social tensions. Now, we can also see tensions between these important people and others in society. I'll come back to that question in a few minutes when I talk about law. Mesopotamia is a large open plain. You have 2 rivers surrounded by desert with mountains at the far edges of this region. The area has no natural frontiers. There is nothing there to ward off invasion, nothing there to ward off migration. We could think, for example, today, there is an example that would give us some sense of the way it must have been in antiquity. I'm referring to the Kurds. These are people who live in northern Iraq, eastern Syria, southeastern Turkey, northwestern Iran. They are a stateless people. They simply move around. Well, they've been doing this for millennia. And in antiquity, this must have been the way this Mesopotamian world was virtually all the time. Now, the areas beyond Mesopotamia, or the areas sort of on its fringes, along its edges, were inhabited by people who basically could see the higher cultural development, the higher political development, the higher economic development, the greater prosperity of the Mesopotamian cities. And not surprisingly, they were attracted, like moths to a bulb on a summer night, to these Mesopotamian cities. And they came again, and again, and again, and again. Yes, it's true, and eventually great conquerors, the Persians, and then Alexander, and then the Romans, and then the Arabs, and then the Turks, have overrun this part of the world. But on a much smaller scale, that process of overrunning Mesopotamia was happening even in antiquity. Now, after about 2350 BC, so we have the period before 3000 is sort of the Uruk period, when we can see civilization taking its rise, and the period after 3000, when the various Sumerian cities are sort of working out in the dynastic period, their own local political, social, economic development. After about 2350, we see for the first time one of these great conquests of the region of Sumer, southern Iraq, by an outside force. In this case, the individuals involved were the Akkadians. Now, the Akkadians came from the area, if you're going up the Tigris and Euphrates River, and you can always try to remember that the Tigris is on top. So you have the 2 rivers, Tigris and Euphrates. The Tigris is on top. Mesopotamia technically would be the land between those 2 rivers, precisely what the word means. What is between the rivers, Mesopotamia, all right? But actually, we think of Mesopotamia also as the land lying on both sides of those rivers, okay? Akkad is in the area where the rivers sort of bow out just a little bit, sort of north and west of Sumer, a sort of slightly fat region in the middle where the rivers bow out before they come close together again and flow into the mountains in Anatolia, antiquity, Turkey today. So Akkad is up there, a few hundred miles to the north of Sumer. In Akkad, there emerged a very powerful, a very ambitious, and a militarily gifted king, and his name was Sargon. Sargon ruled from 2371 to 2316 BC. He turned the Akkadians into a very effective fighting force, and then he began to move to the south. And later on, his son and successor actually moved eastwards towards what we would think of as Iran, and westwards actually almost towards the Mediterranean Sea. Now, let me tell you a story about Sargon. Sargon's an interesting fellow. He was found floating in a reed basket in the river Tigris by serving maidens of the queen. He was brought into the palace and found to be a fine and healthy baby boy, and was raised among the children of the servants in the palace. And eventually, of course, he was so intelligent and capable and gifted and brave and resourceful that he was brought in to serve among the king's assistants. And eventually, he became the king himself. Now, that may just remind you of someone else you've heard of. I have in mind Moses, of course. You see, now Moses never got to be Pharaoh in Egypt, but he rose pretty high in the Egyptian service. It's not surprising that riverine civilizations will tell two kinds of stories about rivers. Stories where the rivers bring you wonderful things, and stories where the rivers crush you in terrible floods. And so we have Sargon as a good thing that was brought to the Akkadians by their river. One of the most important things for us to say about Sargon is that when he conquered the Sumerians to the south, rather than destroying their culture, rather than putting the Sumerians to death, rather than sort of overrunning them and bringing sort of the forces of darkness and barbarism to them, he actually absorbed Sumerian culture in all sorts of important respects. Now, very much later, the Roman poet Horace would say that captive Greece took her captor captive. Well, the point is that that has happened many times historically, that people at a lower cultural level conquer people at a higher cultural level, and instead of destroying their culture, they absorb it. That's a first point with respect to Sargon. A second is that this is the first moment of the dissemination of Sumerian culture over a much larger imperial state. Now, some years after Sargon and the Akkadians began to weaken as their power began to decline, Sumer was overrun, and as indeed much of Mesopotamia was overrun again by people whom we call the Old Babylonians. We meet these people in the Old Testament as the Amorites. Their most famous king was Hammurabi, the one who issues the great law code. And we'll have something to say about that law code in just a few minutes. But once again, when the Old Babylonians conquer the area of Mesopotamia, and indeed the area of Sumer, what they do is spread Sumerian culture. They don't destroy it. They don't sort of make it vanish. They spread it. As these slightly larger imperial states continued to grow, what began to happen is there was what we might call a Sumerianization of the culture of much of the Middle East. And this provided a kind of a common foundation, a common basis for cultural life in that part of the world. Now, we'll return to this part of the world in some later lectures from some other angles. For the moment, let's turn and ask ourselves a little bit about the culture of Sumer, the culture of these earliest of peoples. What were they like? What is their culture like? We might turn in the first place to their religion. What do we know about their religion? Well, we know, for example, that these people were polytheistic, all right? Quite simply, they worshipped many gods and goddesses. Polytheistic. We know also that they were syncretistic. Syncretistic. Now, what that means, that's a fancy word that actually means something very simple. They were quite happy and willing to borrow things from their neighbors. If, for example, your neighbor conquered you, this might lead you to believe that your neighbor's gods were more powerful than your own. Now, you don't jettison your own and take on the new ones in their place. You add the new ones. You hedge your bets. If your neighbors have finer flocks than you do, if your neighbors have more abundant crops than you do, their fertility goddesses may be a little more efficient than yours. So you would borrow them. Again, you don't throw yours out. You add some new ones. Syncretism then. a way of spreading certain kinds of religious practices, certain kinds of religious ideas, certain kinds of religious cults. Now, when we think about these gods, we can divide them up in certain fairly basic ways, according to the way the Sumerians themselves did. There were sky gods, gods who were thought to live on mountaintops, way up in the heavens someplace. These are generally thought of as male, and they are generally associated with war, sometimes with government, and sometimes with the more powerful forces of nature, thunder, lightning, the more terrifying forces of nature. There were also earth gods. Now, not surprisingly, earth was understood as feminine. And therefore, those divine beings, specially charged with earth and its fertility and its richness and its abundance, were conceived of as female amongst the various peoples of Sumer and other places as well. Now, in between these male sky gods and female earth gods, there was a whole host of other beings imagined more or less clearly at different times and different places among different people. What we see here is a process that we can characterize as animism. Now, animism means quite simply that you really don't see anything in the world as lifeless, that everything somehow is alive. From wind and rain and storms to animals, even to abstract forces, love, hate, fear. All of these things can somehow be imagined as divine and as greater than and external to ourselves. Now, these gods and goddesses differed from humans in a couple of very basic respects. They were immortal and they were superhuman. In other respects, when we meet them, we know a lot more, for example, about Greek and Roman gods. We'll have more to say about them in later lectures. But they appear much the same. They seem like us, except that they are immortal and they have superhuman powers. The religious rites practiced by the Sumerians were fundamentally aimed at propitiating these gods, at trying to keep them in order. The religion was fatalistic. The religion was pessimistic. Now, these were people who could be conquered at any time. These were people who could be flooded and destroyed at almost any time. The Nile floods absolutely, annually, and predictably and benevolently in Egypt. That is not true of the Tigris and Euphrates. And consequently, it's not surprising that people felt a bit pessimistic and a bit fatalistic about their religion. All they could do was try to keep these gods in order. And I think that that may have been related in certain ways to the geography, to the climate, and sort of to the political life of the area. It's interesting, too, that these gods and goddesses served no ethical functions in these societies. As near as we can tell, how you lived your life made absolutely no difference. Good people didn't get a reward. Bad people didn't get punished. You didn't turn to religion for explanations of how to live well, how to live honorably, how to live justly. These are ideas that we will see emerge slowly and very much later. We can say also of these various religions that they represent something else for us and something quite different from what you might think. If we try to understand the natural order today, we would turn to the various natural sciences for the various rules of how the world works. What we see with the Sumerians was a first attempt, and I think in many respects actually an impressive one, to begin understanding the forces of nature, to systematize them, to give them names, to differentiate among them. The answers that they gave may strike us as primitive, may strike us as utterly incredible, but what is interesting is the beginning of the process of bringing some order into how we think about that world out there. That, I think, is actually a fairly impressive achievement. Law is another important achievement of the Mesopotamian peoples, and in particular, in the first place, of the Sumerians. The laws appear to have been issued, first of all, by councils of notables in conjunctions with priests and kings. Priests early, kings later. These laws are interesting in a number of ways, distinctive in a number of ways. They are not abstract. They are not philosophical. No Mesopotamian law code comes with a great preamble like the American Constitution. There's nothing like our Declaration of Independence. There's no statement of first principles, no liberté, égalité, fraternité. Nothing like that. They are long lists of rules. Do this, do this, do this, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, with oftentimes specific fines attached to the rules. If you do this, it's going to cost you this. And very often the laws are very cruel. You could be sentenced to death for an enormous number of offenses. It is in these laws that we think we can see a lot of the social struggles of these societies, that people were somehow making rules to keep the powerful from destroying the powerless, to keep the rich from overrunning the poor. It's in these law codes that we think we get some feel for the social stresses of these societies. Unfortunately, we have too little evidence really to hang very much flesh and sinew on that skeleton, but that appears to be what we're looking at. Now, the law is interesting to us in a second way. Most of these law codes were carved in great stone tablets and displayed in public places. And this creates the notion that the law is not the arbitrary possession of the powerful, but the possession, in fact, of all people, that it belongs to everyone, that it was public, that it obliges everyone, that everyone is subject to it. So religion and law, two important areas. A third is literature. Now, the greatest of the Mesopotamian works, indeed the greatest of the early works of human literary production, is the Epic of Gilgamesh. This is a Sumerian work. In its oldest form, it goes back probably to about 2500 BC. The versions we have today survive from about 800 BC, which is a testimony to its longevity, a testimony to its durability, to its dissemination. It's an epic. Now, we're going to talk about a lot of epics in these lectures, so let's pause just for a moment and describe what an epic is. An epic is a long poem, usually. It's conceivable to have a prose epic, but generally speaking, it is a poetic work. It is conceived on a grand scale. It deals with gods and heroes. It deals with important subjects. It deals with them in elevated language. And it is universalizing. It makes its points as if for all time and not for a given place and time, for all people and not just for the people mentioned in the story. So these are some characteristics of epics, and we'll talk about other ones as we go along. What about this one? It's a story basically of friendship, of a friendship between Gilgamesh and his great friend Enkidu. Now, Enkidu is the natural man. The poem, first of all, has an epic, a mythic account of the civilizing process. Okay? What that means, Enkidu runs with the animals. He's the natural man. The people in the city are worried about him. And he comes down to a pool to drink all of the time. So the people in the city send a harlot out to seduce him. He has sex with the harlots, and now the animals won't come near him anymore. He's been civilized. Once again, the woman becomes the bad guy in the story about the civilizing process, the fall of Enkidu. Well, Enkidu then comes into the city. Well, Gilgamesh, who's a big, tough guy himself, has been looking for a buddy, two bubbas that can hang out together. Well, now, finally, one bubba's got another one. And they go and have all kinds of amazing adventures. They kill the bull of heaven, and they fight with Humbaba, and they travel all over the place. And then Enkidu gets sick and dies. And the poem has a poignant refrain. And the worm fastened on him. And it poses this really quite wonderful existential problem. You're born, you live, you die, the worm gets you. So what? What did it all matter? Well, now, Gilgamesh goes in search of immortality. He goes off chasing a guy named Zazudra in some version of the story, Utnapishtim in others. He gives him a branch, which presumably if he consumes it or something will grant him immortality. He fails to consume it right away, and a snake takes it away from him. The snake's back in the story now, and of course the immortal snake, and so on. And Gilgamesh is forced to realize that we will only have such immortality as exists in the memory of those who come after us. We cannot live forever. Quite a remarkable work. Not the only work. There was, for example, a woman, Enkiduana, daughter of Sargon, who was the first known woman poet. Quite a remarkable figure she was. Now, we can say, for example, in areas like mathematics and sciences, perhaps the Mesopotamians derived this from their hydraulics, perhaps they derived this from watching the heavens above them, perhaps from measuring fields. Hard to say. They developed pretty sophisticated mathematics. They developed the decimal, but also the sexadecimal system. You ever wonder why we have 60 seconds in a minute and 60 minutes in an hour? Thank the Sumerians for that. They understood place value in numbers, for example. They understood why 35 is different from 53. That's not obvious. That's not self-evident that you go left or right or something. They understood that. They anticipated a number of Greek developments in mathematics and in science. And they left then a very considerable legacy. The legacy was of these Sumerian people conquered again and again and again, who provided in religion, in law, and in certain basic sciences a foundation from the eastern shore of the Mediterranean to the western border of Iran, or Persia in antiquity, on which one civilization after another would build, or which we may regard in a sense as kind of the foundation under the Western civilization that we'll continue to pursue in our later lectures, as indeed in the very next one when we turn to Egypt.